NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
As Alan sat in the waiting room of that hospital, he had only one thought going through his mind. God, I hope this works. After years of pills and medication and new pills and better pills and new treatments, after years of psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, group therapy, after years of taking herbal medications, going to meditation, doing yoga, going through hypnotherapy, nothing had worked. In many ways, today was his last hope as he sat in that hospital room waiting for his first treatment in elective convulsive therapy, ECT, or shock treatment, as some would call it. And as Alan sat in that hospital room waiting to go in for his first treatment, his mind drifted back to an earlier time, to his days in high school. He was a bit of a nerd in high school, sure. He was brilliant, still brilliant, and had a lot of friends in high school, and all of those friends together were competing to become the valedictorian of his high school class. It was a competition that Alan quite easily won. And when he went to give his high school graduation speech, Alan walked to the podium with purpose. He didn't give a speech that was fluffy about keeping friends and staying friends and having fun in college. He didn't quote Dr. Seuss. He quoted Malcolm X. And people in the audience at that high school graduation speech raised their fists. They were so inspired by his words. Many people thought it was too much, but not one member of the class of 1992 has ever forgotten that speech. And at reunions, they will still say how inspired they were by it. Alan's goal at that time was to change the world by becoming a doctor. He wanted to be an infectious disease doctor and cure diseases like HIV/AIDS. And he sailed through college, 4.0, valedictorian again of his college class, full rides to medical schools across the country. But he never made it to medical school because the summer between his last year of college and his first year of med school, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And it has been a 22-year struggle for him, trying every treatment that you can imagine. And if you ask him, he would tell you to get back his brain. That's a story about a person who suffers from a mental illness. It's a story that you could tell at the beginning of a sentencing, in the middle of a sentencing, at the end of a sentencing. It's a story about an individual person, who they were. It's a story that has a theme. And it's a story that, quite frankly, I think, or I hope, is more entertaining than a list of symptoms and the name of an illness like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Today, what I want to talk to you about is telling stories, telling our clients stories, focusing less on the diagnosis, the symptoms, reading off the names of drugs and disorders and things like that, and focus on telling stories of our clients' lives that might move a judge to sentence our client the way we want. Now, I will tell you a couple of things as a caveat. I'm like a little nervous to be here today because there's a lot of you in this room who know a heck of a lot more about mental health than I do. From my own office, our director of mental health advocacy is here. One of our attorneys who's a pioneer in our mental health court in Essex and Newark, New Jersey, they're both in the audience. And I'm like, well, what do I have to give to people who probably know a lot more about mental health than me? So what I want to focus on with you today is sentencing and telling stories at sentencing. And everything that I'm going to say applies to any sentencing that we do, really, as criminal lawyers. But I also want to focus a little bit on regular judges. And by that I mean trying to tell these stories to judges who are not hearing mental health cases on a regular basis. All of these techniques will work on people who are hearing mental health cases on a regular basis, but I think our biggest challenge is convincing judges who are managing regular criminal courtrooms that they shouldn't be afraid of our clients' mental illness, and understand who our clients are. They need to understand that illness and consider it as a factor in sentencing. I will also tell you, like I said, I'm not a doctor. I am not a specialist in mental health law. And a lot of what I have learned comes from my clients throughout the years, but a lot of what I have learned also comes from a person who's very special to me, and that is my friend who I'm calling Alan today. That's me in the black. I don't know if it's right or left, on the left-hand side, at our high school graduation. And over the past 26 years, I have learned so much from Alan about how to pull the stories from clients who suffer from mental illness and how to sort of translate those stories into language that judges, and quite frankly, anybody, I hope, can understand. So what we're going to talk about today is a couple of different things. What I want to talk about, first of all, is how judges make decisions. Because in order to persuade a judge, we need to understand how people, judges, make decisions. We're going to talk a little bit about getting the story from our clients. And then finally, we're going to talk about ways to tell those stories back to judges that meet the needs of sentencing in mental health cases. So first, how do we make decisions? So whenever any one of us makes a decision, there's two parts of our brain that are working. One is the intuitive section of our brain that's pictured on the left. The other is the deliberative section. And they kind of are what they sound like. The intuitive part of our brain is that part that says, this is what I feel. These are the emotions I'm getting. It's kind of your gut, right? Your first instinct. And the deliberative part is the slower, conscious, thinking part of our brain. And you see that big old 95 down at the bottom? That should scare you a little bit, because 95% of the 10,000 decisions that we make every day are made on instinct, gut, intuition alone. And of those, 80 to 93% of that kind of intuitive decision-making comes from our life experiences and our social perception. So how we were raised, what our experience in life has been. We are guided by past behavior and instinct. And in case you're wondering, do judges' brains work any differently than ours? The answer to that question, you heard it here first, folks, is judges are no different than any one of us. Chris Guthrie at Vanderbilt University has been doing some great studies on judicial decision-making for judges at the trial level. How do trial-level judges make decisions? And he's found that both of these systems operate when judges are making decisions. And the vast majority of decisions made by judges are them having an intuition and then conforming to that intuition. Scary. Especially when we think about what our intuition tells us about mental health in this country. Americans have a very unique perspective when you look at studies where you compare our culture to other places throughout the world when it comes to mental health. This was an interesting study that was conducted about the news media and how mental health is sort of inexorably linked to violence and crime in our national media. And when you look at the headlines any day, these are the types of articles that we see. And some of you may have had these kinds of cases, right? So these kind of like this, we get this sort of like loaded word thing going on, right? Where you hear the word, pick one, psychotic, delusion, hallucination. And the image that appears in our mind is one of danger. Even though all of us who've had mental health cases know that these are clinical terms, they have definitions, and they may not make somebody dangerous at all. 2015 study, 46% of Americans believe that people with a mental health disorder are more likely to be violent, when in fact, it's only 4% of people that are violent, and more people with mental health disorders are more likely to be victimized than to be the perpetrators of crime. And we see study after study about people feeling like they don't want to live next door to somebody with a mental health issue. They don't want to work with somebody with a mental health issue. They don't want to see somebody at a party with a mental health issue. And the studies go on and on. So that is connected. We're fools if we believe that a judge's initial intuition isn't going to connect to some of this stuff that is all around us and is part of sort of the way we've grown up. So we have to start thinking about ways to combat that judge's initial inclination to connect mental illness with violence. And one of the ways, and this is from some of Chris Guthrie's studies, there's a number of different studies, is to try to tap into this thing called override, which is to at least halt the judge's initial reaction long enough that we can get in there and kind of override that initial instinct. But there's three concepts that we have to be aware of when we're doing that. One is this concept called anchoring. And what that is in simple terms, is let's say you want the judge to give your client a 10, the prosecutor wants a 20, the judge reads the sentencing memo and the pre-sentence memo and says, I think I'm going to give him a 15. By the time you get to oral argument, you're not getting a 10. The prosecutor's not getting a 20. You might be really good at oral arguing and move it to a 12. You might move it to a 17 or an 18 prosecutor, but the judge has thrown an anchor at a place where they're comfortable. So we have to think about ways to trigger the throwing of the anchor closer to the position that we want. Another is something called the identifiable victim effect. This is a study that was conducted, I think, first in 2007 and has been often repeated by advertisers and marketers, but it's also referenced in Guthrie's research. It's this idea that the initial study was done with a World Hunger commercial, and it was, how do we get people to give the most money to solve childhood hunger? And the first commercial was of little Timmy, who is starving, just about little Timmy. The next commercial was all the statistics. Here's how many children are starving all over the world. Here's how child hunger in the world. And then the last commercial was little Timmy and his story, but superimposed were all the statistics about child hunger. Guess who got the most money? Just little Timmy all by himself. So stories about individual people will help a judge connect emotionally. So we can get a judge to emotionally connect, to intuitively connect to our client, and at least hold off some of the forces that are going to be working against us in these kinds of cases. There's also this concept called cognitive dissonance, which is if a judge does have a very strong belief about something, they are going to be likely to sort of ignore facts that come their way. So how does this inform our practice? I think in a lot of ways. One, we have to acknowledge the implicit bias and somewhat explicit bias against people with mental illness and figure out how to take that on. Number two, we got to open really strong. You have to file sentencing memoranda that open very strong to get the judge to throw the anchor closer to the position that you want. You need to focus on stories and recognize the fact that all of your facts, your statistics about mental illness, your list of medications that the client is taking, your list of dates the client went to the hospital, is going to wash over the judge. And it's the stories that the judge is going to pay attention to. So we're going to talk about telling those stories in a number of different contexts. So I think of sentencing as like a two-part thing. One is we got to find the client's story, because every client has a different story to tell. And two, we have to close the barriers, close the escape routes that the judge is going to take, like, well, he could relapse, or well, he's dangerous because he's a schizophrenic, right? We got to close those doors. So how do you find the story of somebody's life? I like to think of it as trying to find a thread that you can kind of pull, a theme. If I had to tell you the theme of my friend's journey with mental illness, it would be kind of this brain that betrayed him. And every time he has slipped, every time that he has gone off his medication, it's always been a time that there's a problem that he had to solve, and he felt like he needed to get off the meds to get his brain back for just, he's like, I'm just going to get it back for a minute, and then I'll go right back to the meds, right? So that kind of brain that betrayed him would be my theme if, God forbid, I ever had to do a sentencing that involved him. But his story is not the same as somebody else's story, even though the diagnosis of schizophrenia might be the same. So you might think this is a story that sounds similar to Alan's, or even similar to the story that Dr. Watson told us before, right? The promising, brilliant student who takes a journey with mental illness. But her story is not the same. And I'm gonna show you some clips from this story, talk a little bit about Alan's story, and we're gonna introduce another story in a minute, that her symptoms are different, her journey in life is different, her treatments have been different, and she is a different person than another person with schizophrenia. So that's what I mean by finding the story. It's not a story of who are you, what's your diagnosis, and what is your medical history. It's a story of who are you as a human being, and how do I tell a full story about you as a human being who suffers from a mental illness. I am not going to talk a lot about client communication. We could do a whole hour on communicating with clients with mental illnesses. It is not my area of expertise, nor is it something we have time to do. But client communication is essential for sentencing. This lecture is called Sentencing from the Beginning because you have to build the partnership from the beginning to get the data that you need to tell a compelling sentencing argument at the end. You can't wait to the day before sentencing to sit down with your client suffering from anxiety and depression and be like, all right, now tell me the story of your life, right? It's not gonna work. It has to start from the beginning. And what I want you to remember is that you cannot go into these meetings with clients, with any client, let alone a client with mental illness, with an agenda. And it kind of enforcing what you want. With all of my clients, and this includes clients who suffer from mental illness, I always start my interviews and I'll say, we have an hour to talk today. I need about 15 minutes to talk to you about your emotion. For the first 45 minutes, what do you want to talk about? Every interview with every client. And if I'm listening to somebody ramble for 45 minutes, whether it's because of mental illness or because they haven't talked to somebody in a while, for whatever reason, I'm still finding things I can use in those 45 minutes, and it's far more informative than me having an agenda and going in and talking about what I want to talk about. So remember, status is fluid. And as you were listening for those 45 minutes or however much time you've got, listen with your whole being, not just to what somebody's saying, but how they are saying it. And you can get a lot of information just by observing other people. You want to have the experience. If you're going to sit down with somebody for an hour, you want the meaning and the experience. So I want to talk about two things about kind of gathering client stories that are particular to mental illness. I think one is the importance of setting expectations. We have to do that with any client. But what I mean is you need to talk to your client about the fact that you were going to talk about their mental illness. I've talked to so many lawyers who are, I'm like, well, what did they say about kind of what's going on? I don't know, I didn't ask them, I didn't want them to be uncomfortable. And you may have clients who don't want to talk about it at certain points, but at some point you have to say, how can I make this easiest for you to talk to me about it, right? I remember for years going to dinner with my friend Alan, and he'd look at me and look at the door, and he'd look at me and look at the door. Because you see, Alan has delusions that other people think he's going to kill them. That's his delusions. It's a little strange. And I wouldn't want to say anything because I was like, I don't know what he's doing. He might be looking, like, I don't know why he's looking at the door. So we'd have these like awkward dinners. And then finally one day I was like, dude, what's going on? He's like, I'm just really uncomfortable in this restaurant. Check, please. And we went somewhere else. So it's as easy as kind of changing the environment. Or saying to your client, is it better if I talk to you in the morning or the afternoon? Are short interviews better? Are longer interviews better? Tell me, I mean, it sounds funny, but help me help you, right? How can we best work together to uncover this story? And you also have to, we think, I think sometimes as practitioners, that we are immune from all of that stuff that I talked about in the beginning. The media, the bias that against mental illness. I think it's one of the last biases that it's almost like socially acceptable to have. And some of it is explicit. Marissa and I were just talking before about it may not even be implicit. Some of it is explicit bias that you hear. And we think we're immune because we work in this field, or we work with people who are mentally ill on a regular basis. A couple of years ago, has anybody ever taken the Harvard implicit bias study for race? Probably a lot of hands. Okay. Anybody ever taken the mental illness one? Okay, like I see one hand. So Harvard has these implicit bias studies. You hear them talked a lot about when it comes to like discovering implicit racial bias. Years ago, and there's a whole bunch. There's some gender, there's some for sexual orientation, there's all sorts of Harvard implicit bias studies. And there's one on mental illness. I took it a couple of years ago, and I didn't like my results. So yesterday, I was like, I'm gonna take it again. I have been thinking about this stuff for weeks. I try to learn and read as much as I can about mental illness, particularly about schizophrenia because of my good friends. So I feel like I'm gonna do better. These are my results. And I say that because it was a little, like I was like really trying to ask myself whether I wanted to put this in there because I really feel like exposed right now. But we have to recognize our own stuff, right? I have to know that I am fighting against my perceptions, the way I was raised, experience that I have growing up, a media that washes over with images about mental illness, movies, our culture. I carry that into an interview room with my client. So I can either pretend it doesn't exist and that I'm somehow righteous, or I can acknowledge that some stuff may come up for me in that meeting and say, you know what, that's okay. Let me think through this, and let me think, more importantly, how to help my judges think through this, right? So we have to admit that there is a bias out there, and I guess I'm ashamed and not ashamed to say it. Another thing you have to do is kind of prepare yourself. I think reading as much as you can about multiple people's stories with a particular mental illness is important because, like I said, they're not all the same. This book, The Center Cannot Hold, is brilliant. If you haven't read it, Dr. Ellen Sachs is a Yale law graduate and a psychologist who has had a 30-year journey with schizophrenia. And this is a beautiful, beautiful memoir. But there's all sorts of sources of information out there. I love the sites. There's a lot of sites for like kind of support sites for people with mental illness, and they can go and they can share their stories about mental illness. And by reading those, it can give you insight into the different ways that an illness can manifest itself as you talk to your client. I will tell you, oh, that's another one. So there was a period of time where my friend was not, he couldn't hold down a job. And I was trying to talk to him about it. And you know, you're trying to be like kind and supportive. You're like, go in there and try harder, right? And he would keep leaving these great jobs that he had gotten. And he's like, I can't explain it to you why I can't work. And we would have these conversations and trying to figure it out. And then I read Dr. Sachs's book, and there's a chapter in there that talks about people who told her just try harder, right? And I was like, oh, this makes sense to me. And then I asked him to read it. And then he's like, okay, it's not quite like that for me, but this part is similar. And by using the experience of somebody else's journey with that mental illness, we could come up with a common vocabulary. And you can do this. I have done this with my clients. I've taken a couple of different examples of stories of people with mental illness, given it to them, and said, does any of these resonate with you? And they've sometimes said, yeah, this one. Sometimes they've said, I'm not quite like this, but this makes a little bit of sense, right? So find other ways to share a vocabulary with your clients. If you yourself have not experienced mental illness, you can use third parties who have as ways to kind of build a bridge, if that makes sense. So once you find the thread, what do you do with it? Well, this is a structure that I recommend for sentencing in these types of cases. You want to do a creative introduction. You want to tell the judge the sentence that you want. You want to acknowledge the social perceptions and close the doors to them for the judge. Consider the point of view, who is telling the story. Incorporate all of the senses, and then you're going to finish strong by tying it back to the beginning. So start strong and end strong. And what I mean by that is finding a story that expresses your theme. So I told you one story at the beginning that kind of expressed my theme. If I were going to tell the story of my friend Alan, there's all different entry points to stories, right? So you're going to find the one that works best. You may even want to start with somebody's worst moment. What is the worst that this illness has looked like from them as a starting point so we can figure out how not to get back there again? And this is a good example. So that could be the beginning of the story, right? sort of the lowest point in the story, and then how changes have taken place to not go back there again. So you could start with the offense, right, in a criminal case. Start with the offense. Embrace the fact that the offense might be horrific, and the facts might sound very strange, and then back out from there. So there's all sorts of different entry points of story. The point is, you want to start really strong with something that tugs at the emotions of the judge. Not, my client is 26 years old, she's suffered, right? So then tell the judge what you want. I love it when people are like, I'm going to wait till the end to tell him what I want. The judge needs if the judge has already thrown the anchor in his mind, you need to throw yours. Judge, this is where we are going. This is what I'm going to ask you to do. And let the judge filter what you're telling him through the lens of the outcome that you're going to be asking for. And then finally, you got to start closing doors. Now, the doors are so much harder to close in these cases because you've got like double doors that you've got to close. I have a whole lecture where we just talk about, this is like a regular sentencing lecture. The whole lecture is about closing these doors. These are the aggravating factors in almost every state about sentencing. We're not even going to talk about those doors today because we got to close these doors, right? The barriers in mental health cases. So what are some of the barriers for sentencing in mental health cases? Well, the stigma attached to the diagnosis, right? The social perceptions about mental illness, this idea that somehow anyone who's mentally ill is dangerous. And I'll tell you, there's a reason that I focus a little bit on schizophrenia in this presentation. And it's not just because of my personal story, but because it's I think the most loaded when it comes to the stigma of violence, right? Every time you hear schizophrenia in a movie, that character is not going to be somebody that you want to have move next door, right? With the exception of a couple of movies, but even like the Beautiful Mind thing, right? Like, so there's to me, it's the most loaded when you talk about stigma. Symptoms. The symptoms themselves are equally loaded sometimes. Hallucinations, delusions, hearing voices, right? There's a lot of stigma attached to the symptoms as well. There's a lack of understanding about treatment, about the effectiveness of treatment, about the availability of treatment, about the way we used to treat mental illness and the way we treat it now. There's a lot of uncertainty about medication, right? The judge always says, how do I know that they're going to keep taking their meds? Right? So how do we get around that? And then the cure or lack thereof, right? There are mental illnesses that are more curable than others, but this idea that you're sentencing somebody who's never going to be, quote unquote, cured in the traditional sense, like I have a broken ankle and now it's cured, right? So I think starting with the diagnosis, I don't think we can say it enough, that with the diagnosis, one size does not fit all, right? You can be schizophrenic, but that means a collection of symptoms. Which symptoms does your client have and how do they manifest themselves? So I wish that she would stop looking for pulsars and come advocate in our courts because it's such a wonderful way of sort of explaining and such insight into her disorder. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, insight versus those of our clients who don't have a lot of insight. But right, so we need to dial it back and explain to the judge, and I'm guilty of it myself. I say, he is diagnosed with this. I don't explain what that means. I don't explore what the symptoms are, right? So saying, and this is a perfect way to describe schizophrenia. It's an umbrella of symptoms. These are the symptoms of the disease. These are the ones that John Smith has, and these are the ones he's never had. My friend Alan, who had some hallucinations sort of closer to the beginning and has not hallucinated really since. He has delusions. But if I were talking about this to a judge, I would want to put that into perspective as compared with somebody who's actively hallucinating, right? So thinking about the symptoms and what they mean and drilling down into what those look like and explaining to judges that it is not one size fits all. What they learned about schizophrenia last week might be different in this case. So that's sort of, and she details more of this in this TED Talk, but that's sort of a broad brush explanation of her hallucinations, what they are, how they come. She can talk about those. For my friend Alan, like I said, he has delusions, disorganized thoughts, disorganized behavior and speech. His delusions kind of arise out of fear that other people think that he poses a danger to them, which makes being in crowds really difficult, which makes particularly crowds where people are like milling around and standing around very difficult for him. So starting to identify and drill down with our clients, what is the disease? What are the symptoms? How do they manifest? And how do they manifest themselves in this particular client? What does that look like? Now, I recognize that the people that we are talking about, Dr. Sachs, Ms. McGow, my friend, all have tremendous insight into their own illnesses. It wasn't always like that for Alan in the beginning. He had very little insight, because why would you in the beginning, right? And some people gain insight over time and some people don't. If you have a client who doesn't have a lot of insight into their own illness, that's when you need to depend upon not only the doctors, not only physicians who are working with them, not only people like Dr. Watson and some of the other doctors that we have in the audience, but you also need to do the background, talk to their family, talk to their friends, talk to people who knew them before the onset of their illness, talk to people who knew them after. You can't tell the story of someone's life by looking at one moment and one illness and saying that that defines everything. And a lot of times these other folks are going to be even better in some instances at telling the story than your client. We saw the example earlier of Dr. Sachs, right, where her friend comes to the house and finds her in sort of that, I don't want to call it the rock bottom, but finds her at a very low points in the history of her illness. That story is probably better told. I bet if we could hear her friend tell that story, it would be a lot more vivid and it would have a lot more detail, because she's telling a story of a time that she was having a psychotic episode. So her perception of it, and I don't know if her perception of it is accurate, but it sounds like when she's reading it and when she writes about it in her book, that she's telling it based on what her friend told her. So if I were going to use that story, I would want to talk to her friend. Tell me what that moment was like, so that I can tell the story to the judge, or he can tell the story to the judge in vivid technicolor detail. So you don't necessarily always need your client to be the best reporter if you're willing to do the work to talk to all the people that know her or know him and can give you little bits and pieces of their life. No different than mitigating in any other kind of case. All right, so letting the judge experience it. There are ways that we can let the judge experience what it's like to be in our client's head. Some of these I think you can use all the time. Some I would use with a little bit more caution, and we'll talk about it. But I'm going to share with you a couple of ideas. One is using analogies. So when we look at the research about decision-making, and some of the research, including judicial decision-making, judges, for whatever reason, seem to be particularly open to analogies in terms of a way for them to filter the life of somebody else through their own experience, right? And think about what I showed you in the very beginning, right? 95% of us, like 80 to 95% of us making decisions based on our own experiences. If you can relate to something that I know about, I'm going to be able to process that through the filter of my own life, my own experiences. Analogies are a great way to do that. So this is a common one. You hear people who suffer from schizophrenia kind of describing it as a waking nightmare. So that could be an analogy you use. You could use an analogy your client gives you, right? If your client tells you something that kind of resonates with you, use that. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was talking to a colleague of mine in the office who I had no idea had, after she had had her first child, suffered from severe postpartum depression and stopped speaking for a period of time. And she was talking to me about this presentation, and we were kind of talking about language and getting people to describe mental illness, and she said this to me. The words that the doctor used, selective mute, were strange to me. They're still strange today. What the doctor meant was that my vocal cords were working properly, that I was physically able to make sound. But for me, there was nothing selective about it. I knew I could not speak. My thoughts were like strings. And no matter how hard I tried, I could not get them to connect to spoken words. And I was like, I gotta write that down. Because it's not, when you read those words on their face, I still don't know, like reading it like intellectually and objectively, if it makes a whole lot of sense. But to me, when she said it to me, it really evoked the emotion of what it must be like to not be able to have words in your head and not be able to get them to come out of your mouth. So analogies can do two things, right? Analogies can be an explanation, like we saw Dr. Seth, but can also be an analogy that gets the judge to feel the emotion. This one is from a website. It was from Teen Vogue. I research all places. Teen Vogue. And young women talking about their experience with anxiety and depression. And when one young woman was asked to describe what it was like to have anxiety and depression, she said it was like breathing through a coffee stirrer. A daily battle against yourself, a desire to live, yet at the same time a desire to stop. Right? Like that sort of that emotion that you get from thinking about breathing through a straw, right? That was such, I thought, a great way. It kind of made me anxious when I read it, right? It was a great way to describe that feeling of panic. So think about, and you can access these sites if you like type in sites for people with depression where they're describing what it's like, or articles where people describe what it's like to live with depression or bipolar or schizophrenia or whatever the illness may be. You can get some really great analogies from those sources. You can also literally put the judge in the shoes of your client. There are simulators out there. I don't know, has anybody ever been through a mental health simulator of any kind? Okay, yeah. I did a schizophrenia simulator. I mean, it was terrifying. And so like when I'm suggesting that you ask a judge to take a simulation of mental illness, I think you need to be careful. Because as a person who has not experienced mental illness, you just jumped me right into like level 10 on the schizophrenia simulator. And I was terrified. I had nightmares for days. I was terrified. That may not be what it is like for your client. But if you have a client who's not showing up for treatments, who's not doing what they're supposed to do, that's not showing up for appointments, and you have a judge saying, I don't understand why they can't just show up. Maybe that's the judge who needs to hear the voices that your client is hearing. But a couple of caveats. You have to make sure that what the simulator is true to the exact symptoms that your client has. And you got to make sure that you're using it for the right case and for the right purpose, and it's not going to actually send the judge in the other direction, which is to scare him. And this is a little clip of Anderson Cooper taking one of these simulators. It was for schizophrenia. It was a show on schizophrenia, and it was a person who was hearing voices, and that was the simulator that he did. Same goes for treatment. Everything is a story, and I don't want you to think that I'm suggesting you get up there and talk for 3 hours and tell stories about everything. But if there's something that's important to you to get to the judge to understand, I think you need to tell stories around it. There's a lot of misconception about the treatment for mental illnesses, right? So we need to start thinking about stories around those. We talked about electroconvulsive therapy. I was at a meeting the other day where somebody brought up ECT, and a couple of people in our mental health department were talking about it, and there was somebody in the room who I think didn't have a really good understanding of what it is, and he was kind of like making fun of it, but it was like shock treatment, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, like that kind of. And we were all saying, the people who have had friends who've experienced it or people who know about it from working with clients, we're like, no, it's really effective. My friend Alan got a lot of help doing it, right? So we're saying things like that. And then I had to step back and go, what we're saying is not really helpful to this person at all. Because we're just giving him conclusions. I'm saying, it helped my friend Alan. The other people in the room were like, oh, it's different than it is today. But we didn't tell this person how, right? You go to a waiting room, you wait, you go in, you're unconscious. It's not Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest where they're strapping electrodes to your head with your eyes wide open. But that's not what it is. It's no different than going in and getting an operation. So I think as we are in the world and we're having conversations about mental illness, think about if a judge said that or had that misconception, how would I overcome it? And think about ways to explain mental health treatment in those terms. When it comes to medication, we want to know that the age-old question is, how do we make sure this person keeps taking their medication? Well, you want to tell stories there too. You want to detail what every medication does, what it's for, and what it's not for. Not every pill is the same. Not every pill does the same thing, right? You want to describe the positive effects, and then you need to tell stories that explain previous times where the person has stopped taking their medication and what is in place so that that won't happen again. And I think behind that, the real story is a story of desire. Like, I remember my friend telling me that he was going to go do these ECT treatments and making that decision, and that there was such a desire to be well that he was willing to let somebody shock his brain. And to me, that is not a story of any kind of failure. That is a story of hope. That is a story of somebody who's going to do whatever it takes to conquer his illness, right? So thinking about taking medications and the treatment regimen or whatever it is that's being prescribed as a way that you can show your client's desire to be well, and that that's going to motivate him, if that makes sense. And then finally, you want to do a little reality check. I think there is a place for the statistics. There is a place for these numbers that the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent, will never commit a violent offense, right? So we need to, at some point, throw that stuff in, but we need to prime the pump with the emotional stories first. So the judge is going to be more willing to think your client falls into the 96% of people who are not going to commit an offense instead of focusing on that 4% of the people who are going to do something violent. Some other ways to assure the judge are to talk about support systems that people have in place. If you have clients who are fortunate enough to have people in their lives who can kind of like say to them, something going on here, right? So people can check in on them. I think it's good to let the judge know about those things. And you also want to, if there are triggers for your client, you want to talk to the judge about those triggers and how the client is prepared to recognize and respond to them, right? So here's a kind of like a simple little example, right? She knows what one of the triggers is. The color's red and white. She knows what to do to avoid it. Fix this stage for me before I get up there. And if she can't avoid the trigger because the person sitting in front of her is wearing a bright red suit, she knows how to keep that hallucination in her peripheral vision so it doesn't distract her, right? So just explaining what the triggers are, how to avoid them, and then what happens, because this is the big question the judge wants to know. Judge wants to know what happens when you can't avoid it. What are your techniques, right? That can be very helpful to a judge in getting your client to realize that somebody is not going to pose a danger. So after you talk about all the mental health barriers, good luck with this, because we don't have time to talk about it. You've got to talk about your regular barriers, right? You have to do all your aggravating and mitigating and all your regular old sentencing stuff, right? But we're not going to talk about that today. I do want to say one thing about police intervention. The vast majority of, at least in the cases that I have seen, where I have a client who is arrested and a client who is mentally ill, there is some sort of assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, right? Like that seems to be part and parcel of our clients getting taken into custody in these kinds of cases. You need to find the story there too, right? It's not just, and I'm guilty of it myself, I say it all the time, well, judge, the reason that he resisted the officer's arrest is because he's bipolar. It's not really an explanation. Could it be as simple as the reason that your client resisted the officer's arrest is because he was wearing a red and white sweatshirt, he was a plainclothes officer? Right? Could it be that simple that it triggered something? Could it be that in that episode, they thought that your client was, the police officer was the person standing over them with a knife? Tell the story of that moment where they're getting arrested and why the resisting took place and why it's not likely to happen again. Okay. So then you got to go in front of your judges. You got to know who your judge is, right? Know what's going to play with your judge when you're thinking about the order and structure that you want to do these things in. Pictures can be really helpful, particularly pictures that may show what somebody's brain looks like, because I think it makes it more like Judge, this is a medical thing, right? There's something going on in the brain. And then showing pictures of what treatment might look like. This is a picture of a PTSD patient who had been doing mindfulness training for I forget how many years, right? And showing some changes in the brain. You want to use quotes. If your client says something really good and you're writing a sentencing memo, pull it out. Highlight it in the sentencing. This is from a sentencing video. Turning 10 years old was a big event for Austin. His family planned a big party. You know something is like gonna happen at that party, right? But you're gonna listen because you wanna know what happened at the party, right? Using pictures, thinking about embedding pictures into your written papers. Videos. This was from a sentencing that a colleague of mine did. Her client suffered from PTSD. She tried a self-defense case, lost the self-defense, and then had to argue at sentencing, was arguing that his mental illness was mitigation. And she found out her client painted. And he would paint these beautiful pastoral landscapes. So she did the entire sentencing argument with a loop, a PowerPoint loop of just his watercolors behind her. To show, without her having to say it, you could see how peaceful he seemed to be, right? It just gave this overwhelming feeling of peace, right? And don't forget sound. Sound is really important. If you have sound that you can incorporate into your sentencing argument, an interview with a family, friend, your client, scholarly interview, the 911 call, the confession. We've seen some video clips this morning from interviews with a client. MVR footage, dash cam footage, whatever might illustrate a point you're trying to make. And you can put the sound in written motions. I'm a huge fan of putting sound in written motions. Most of us file electronically now, right? Or can, right? Yeah? Okay, so I put sound clips right in my motion, so as the judge reading it, they can click on it and hear something. So this is actually from a Miller hearing, so not quite what we're talking about, but sort of, adolescent brain development. And rather than writing for like pages and pages and pages about the brain, in this little section, I wanted the judge to hear this thing.
I'm Tony Cox, and
so you
this
could
is
click
Tell
on
Me
it
More
in the written
from
motion,
NPR News.
and he could
Michelle
hear
Martin
it.
is away.
And he talked
We'd
about
like
it for
to spend
days.
this
He's
part
like, I
of the
could click
program
on it, and I could
talking
hear
about
it.
the passage
That's how the
from
computer works,
childhood
Judge,
to
right?
adulthood, and how that makes
So think about video. This is a video from a motion a colleague of mine did where she wanted to show a client a study that kind of talked about risk and adolescents' view of risk. They just dumped it right into the motion. You could take that Anderson Cooper video and dump it right into the place where you're going to talk about the voices your client hears. And let the judge click the button. They love it. It's like a cat with a toy. Don't tell them I said that. Cut that out. Right? A day in the life video. Show what your client's daily life is like. Right? That they get up, put on their pants like the rest of us, go to work, do what they're doing. Right? So I'm going to go back to sort of where we started. And hopefully this gave you some ideas about how to put together structures of sentencing. I think you can use these for any kind of case. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's a mental health case. Some of these techniques will work for everything. I hope that you will take some of these ideas. And I think the last part is you have to finish strong, right? So you have to end in some way by tying your argument back to the theme or back to the beginning. So I will tell you that today, my friend Alan is doing really well. He is working. He is just enrolled in school to do some continuing education, and he's volunteering, helping other people with mental health disorders by volunteering at mental health facilities and helping people who are not quite at the point in their journey as he is. And is he the same person that raised his hand and raised his fist in the air all those years ago in 1992? No. But none of us are. And as sad as he is that he never fulfilled that dream of becoming a doctor, he has fulfilled a more important dream, and that's being an inspiration to his friends, an inspiration to his family, an inspiration to the people that he touches at those mental health facilities, and an inspiration to me. And I want to thank him. Thank you.